Well, hey, this is James Riley.
And Beth Riley.
And got another fun edition of our Artist Spotlight podcast series. Beth, who do we have?
Today we have record producer and audio engineer Mark Linett.
Mark, how you doing?
I'm doing good here in Southern California.
We're in Joplin, Missouri, so it's actually turned a little hot.
Oh, wow.
It has been some cooler temperatures, but we went from spring to summer, so...
We've had a few of those days, but yeah, today's another nice one.
There's so much stuff to talk about. There's an upcoming Sounds of Summer Beach Boys collection, 80 songs, and there's so many artists that you've worked with, and we'll touch on some of these later. Of course, the Beach Boys and Brian Wilson, Red Hot Chili Peppers, Randy Newman, Los Lobos, Los Straitjackets, one of our favorite bands, Big Sandy. Give us a brief overview of how you got to now. Like where you started and now, because it's a pretty cool journey.
Well, I've just turned 70. I've been doing this since I was slightly under 20. Having grown up with so much great, pop music. I was 12 in 1964, so Beatlemania. A couple of years older might have been nice, but Beatlemania hit me right where I lived. And so I've always wanted to have something to do technically with entertainment. And I started out still in high school doing lighting, and because of the times I did light shows in the New York area. And then after high school, I started a public address sound system company, and we did a lot of mostly college shows for artists like Seals and Crofts and Livingston Taylor and Shana Na, Jay Giles, probably some others that I'm forgetting, but that lasted a couple of years. And then I moved out here to Los Angeles because I wanted to get into making records. I mean, the fascination with how these incredible records that I was hearing on the radio and the 45s I was buying. I mean, just the magic of all of that, and wanting to, just to know how it was done was just so inspiring that I came out here and spent about a year and a half mostly working in a couple of really lesser quality studios, not doing anything terribly much of note except a comedy album for what was Banana Records, which was an early Saturday Night Live thing, I think an album called The Missing White House Tapes. The producers were taking actual mostly Nixon speeches. We were cutting them up and, had him admit to the real history as opposed to the way he was telling it, and all based on the fact that that tape that had the long gap in it. Anyway, but I never really got anywhere out here. I moved back east, worked in the studio in New York for a little while for a guy named Ed Chalpin, who and some of your listeners may remember, is the guy who signed Jimi Hendrix to a $2 contract and later made millions off it.
Wow.
Among others, getting the Band of Gypsies record. And I actually went through a lot of those tapes, and if any of you are familiar with the bootleg, I think maybe it's a legit release now, called You Can't Use My Name, where there's an interaction between Jimmy and Mr. Chalpin in the studio when Jimmy came to do a favor for his old buddy Curtis Knight and play on a session, and insists that Chalpin can't use his name, and Chalpin says, of course not, and then of course issued it 800,000 times. So I heard all that stuff. And it's ironic that about 10 years later, I wound up working for the Hendrix estate under Alan Douglas for about 15 years. But anyway, to jump back, I was living in Boston at the time. I had given up and gone back to college, God help me. That was never something that I really had in my game plan. But I was still kicking around, trying to find something in audio. And there wasn't a whole lot to choose from in Boston, although probably more than there is now. Through a very strange set of circumstances, I met someone, and on a Friday afternoon, I came home from photography class. I remember that. And I got a phone call because my friend worked at Hanley Sound, which was a big sound company that had done Woodstock and put sound systems in the Fillmore. And the message was that Frank Zappa was starting a tour that night in, I believe it was New Haven. The sound company had provided the guy to mix the PA for that tour. And the guy had turned up for the first show and was deathly ill and wasn't going to be able to do the tour. And they desperately needed somebody to replace him. So I was told to call the road manager. And I'm sure, as long as I knew which end of a microphone you sang into, he would have said, yes, get down here. So I flew down and got there just in time between the opening act, which I think was Mountain, and Frank going on. And the road manager says, well, go out there and watch what this guy does. You're taking over after tonight. Well, in fact, I took over halfway through the show because the guy, I never did find out exactly what happened to him, but he was sick and halfway through the show disappeared. I mixed the rest of the shows, started packing up the gear, and I'm thinking to myself, whatever they offer me, of course I'm going to do this. I was a huge fan of Frank's. And the road manager comes out and says, okay, here's the deal. It's $400 a week. This is 1975, by the way. $400 a week, $25 a day per diem. You get caught using drugs, you're fired. And the next morning, I find myself on the tour bus with Frank, the whole band, including Captain Beefheart. This is the Bongo Fury tour, and the road crew, traveling to the Capitol Theater in Passaic, New Jersey, where I had done a few shows and witnessed a lot of shows. And I was on tour for the better part of the summer. Frank was very forward-thinking in that he was one of the first artists to buy his own production gear, his own sound equipment and lighting. At that point in time, you relied on the promoter to hire sound and lights, unless you played someplace like the Fillmore where they had it built in. When Frank came off the road, he rented his sound and lights and his crew out to ELO, the Electric Light Orchestra. So we took that out over the summer. We came back and did another tour with Frank, and then we did it again with ELO. And at that point, Frank kind of pulled back and let everybody go, the band, the crew, everybody, while he figured out what to do next. I accepted a job with Earth, Wind & Fire, and by the time Frank got a new band together and figured out what he was going to do and called me up to come back to work, I couldn't do it. I wish I could have, because that Earth, Wind & Fire tour almost killed me. Touring with Frank and even ELO was a lot of fun, and we were playing, relatively small venues, theaters, colleges. Earth, Wind & Fire was the hockey rinks at a time when doing shows like that in hockey rinks was ill-advised at best. Anyway, so that was at that point where I really decided I wanted out. I had enough of this. And fortunately, because it was Earth, Wind & Fire, I met George Massenberg, a very famous engineer that did all their famous albums, and he helped me get a job out here at Sunset Sound. Very big, still to this day, famous studio. The Beach Boys did record there for a while in 69, 70, 71. Everything was done there. I mean, the Doors, the Stones, everybody. So I worked there for a couple of years as a staff engineer. Somebody I met there told me about a job at Warner Records studio where they were looking for a full-time engineer, and I applied for that job and got it, and that's where I really came into my own as an engineer. I mean, working with producers Lenny Warnaker and Russ Titleman, working with Randy Newman and Ricky Lee Jones and Los Lobos, and that's also where I met Alan Douglas and started doing the Hendrix stuff for the next, 10, 15 years until the family sued and took it all back. That led to a whole series of projects, and the next big lucky break was calling what was then Oceanway Studios, and was actually had been the two, Bill Putnam studios, including Western Studio 3, where almost all the Beach Boys recordings were made. And I guess I was calling, to book time for one of my clients, but the woman running the place told me that Brian Wilson had a session booked for that Thursday, and they needed an engineer because they didn't have one. Did I want to do it? And it was like, well, sure. This is 1987, the height of the Landy era. So I did that session and wound up working on that project for a year, and then off and on, worked with Brian 10, 11, 12 years. I think the last full project I did with Brian was around 2008, and because of my association with him, when in 87 or 88, Capitol decided they wanted to put Pet Sounds out on CD, the new burgeoning format, I was given that job, and that led to doing the entire catalog on the Capitol Twofers and the Good Vibrations box and the Pet Sounds box, and on and on and on. I mean, it would take me a minute to even list all the related projects, and we could take a sidestep and do another part of my career, which was remote recording, a business that I was always happy to be in. And in 2009, I think it was, actually went big time and put together a remote truck that's still in operation. As a matter of fact, we just recorded Paul McCartney at SoFi Stadium last Friday.
Wow, that's cool.
And here we are. I mean, I kind of skipped over, there's all the Smile projects. I mean, I guess the biggest project with Brian was Brian Wilson Presents Smile, and that's what led me to the Red Hot Chili Peppers in an odd way, because Rick Rubin heard it and, wanted to hire me. Wasn't the best jump-off point. I mean, He initially had wanted me to work with Neil Diamond, which would have been probably more appropriate, but I couldn't do it because I was in New York recording Smile at Carnegie Hall. So, I got hired to work with the Chili Peppers, which was an interesting experience. That is already almost 20, almost 20, is it 20 years ago? What would that be, 2005? So, 17 years ago, somewhere in there.
Wow.
But it did get me my second Grammy, so I guess I can't complain.
That's right, 3 Grammys. And when I think about that, I remember a story that Dean Torrance talked about where he had won a Grammy for packaging, album packaging, and his daughter accidentally broke it, and he would just have it held together with duct tape and, thinking he'd always get a replacement, but they told him he'd have to buy it, and he said, I want it, I'm not going to buy another one. And so hopefully yours are in a better place where you're not going to break them, or have Dean Torrance come over and break them. You don't want to have that.
They're in a place where, unless we have an earthquake, I don't think anything is going to happen to them. But being in California, that's always a very real possibility, I guess.
Oh, absolutely.
Now let's talk about the thing we're talking to you about today. The new and remastered and expanded version of the Beach Boys' Sounds of Summer. It's coming out on June 17th. It's got 80 tracks on 3 CDs and 6 LPs. Describe your mindset going into a project like this and, with songs that are so well known.
Well, a number of things. Yeah, I worked on the original release back in 2003, I think it was. And it's kind of interesting because I remember at the time there were some budget concerns by the label. And that's about the time when even catalog releases started to be based on what the label estimated the sales would be, which I always thought was kind of interesting because I don't know how you could, base anything on that. But they had a number in mind. They decided to do it because they thought it would sell about 500,000 copies, and then of course it went on to sell nearly 4 million so far. I didn't have anything to do with selecting the titles. I think that was between the band and the label. I mean, clearly they're all chart hits, and that meant that some significant records wouldn't be included. I mean, even something as obvious as Sail on Sailor, because it wasn't a big chart hit. I mean, by that point in time, we're talking FM radio, a whole different genre. So this time around, there were 2 things. We wanted to expand it both to include a lot of those important records, B-sides, and other, well-known favorites, but also try to expose people, new listeners, to a bunch of stuff that 3 of us, myself, Alan Boyd, and Howie Edelson, who picked the initial track list and then, got feedback from the group, that we thought, especially based on the reaction to the Feel Flows box last year, might appeal to a broader audience than, the records, if you will, that we refer to as your grandfather's Beach Boys. That includes people like me who, I was buying the Beach Boys records when they came out starting in 1962 when I was 10. To step back and talk about Feel Flows for a second, that was highlighting the Sunflower and Surf's Up albums that came out last year. I've always felt, it's a project that I've been sort of pitching off and on for 20 years because I always felt, as did my cohorts, it was a period that was underrepresented, and an awful lot of people who did know about it felt that it was, almost a different group and a much more contemporary sounding pair of records. And if you go back a little further, we did a project in 2017 called Sunshine Tomorrow, which focused on Smiley Smile and Wild Honey, and had the first stereo mix, Wild Honey, that I did. I did a first-time stereo mix of Smiley Smile a few years earlier. That said, got a huge reaction, much bigger than anybody, maybe not us, but bigger than the label expected. And there's a pretty good progression there from, when the Beach Boys, when the hits started to diminish, and the albums Wild Honey, 2020, Smiley Smile, Friends, it leads right to Sunflower and Surf's Up. So what we wanted to do on this compilation was to obviously represent those projects, but also represent other parts of the catalog that wouldn't normally be on a, sort of your standard hits package. The object being to maybe get, some other and hopefully maybe even younger listeners interested in hearing more and knowing more what the band's been up to for now 60 years.
It's amazing, the longevity, and that Phil Flo's box set last year was just amazing. And we're always digging into the deep tracks and the outtakes and all that kind of stuff. And the cool thing about a project like Sounds of Summer, for all of us that are really digging into the deep stuff, it's a nice reminder of just how huge these hits were, and that they still sound great. Were there any songs that kind of stood out to you while you were doing this? And like, wow, maybe I hadn't listened to that one in a while, or wow, that was a really great song.
Not particularly. I mean, this project, besides, trying to expose a lot of material that, people might not have heard, was also that in the ensuing, what is this now, almost 20 years, the technology has advanced. And, one thing I've been doing for quite a while, I mean, really starting with Pet Sounds, is remixing a lot of the records that were only released in mono. And we could talk about why that was. I mean, it was, well, first of all, because that was the market. I mean, your dedicated market in those days was AM radio and 45 RPM singles, and that was mono. I mean, mono exclusively. And while most of the early Beach Boys albums before the album Today were released in stereo, it was really more of a marketing thing because stereo LPs were a sales item for labels. I mean, the same, it's ironic that the Beatles albums were the same way, and I grew up with those. I really only grew up with the stereos, and they were like the Beach Boys albums, they were mixed very quickly, which was easy because you didn't have a lot of tracks. So starting with the album Today, so Today, Summer Days and Summer Nights, Pet Sounds, Party, Smiley Smile, Wild Honey were all initially released only in mono and an electronically processed stereo, which was very unsatisfying. What's been developed over the last 10 or so years is digital extraction technology, which is a artificial intelligence application that allows the extraction, to some extent, of instruments and vocals from a recording. It works better on some than on others, and it's certainly better now than it was even a few years ago. I can only imagine what it'll be in another 10 years. So for this release, we went back and used the technology on quite a few of the group's tracks, some of which had never been released in stereo, and some that had been done using extraction technology 10 years ago when it was, pretty, I'll say pretty janky. I also used it in a number of instances where while we have a multi-track, it's just a 3-track. Your typical recording up until about for the Beach Boys, up until about 1965, was the backing track would have been everybody recorded in mono. And for the most part, the Beach Boys. I mean, on the Today album, it's about 60-40 Beach Boys versus session musicians. Summer Days is kind of the other way around. And then, of course, Pet Sounds is largely session musicians, although Carl plays guitar on a lot of it and Dennis plays on one track. But that's where it changes. But the technology was you recorded your basic track in mono, and for the most part, you use the other 2 tracks on a 3-track to do your vocals. And so you don't have a lot of choices when you're trying to do a stereo mix. So one thing that we were able to do on these releases was take that mono backing track and using the AI technology, separate the track out so you now have at least guitars, bass, and drums, and I can do a new mix with the instruments separated and you have more control about the placement. So we did that on quite a few of the, we'll say, classic recordings, and then we did some remixes, really just an alternate way of presenting some of the material. I remixed Baby Blue and You Need a Mess of Help to Stand Alone and a few others, just another way of showcasing the band and their music.
What would you say would be the oddest thing about going through like the entire Beach Boys archive? What would be the oddest thing that you've seen?
Well, I guess what I would say would be the amount of their recording catalog that has been preserved. Besides the fact that anything besides the finished product was not considered by the artist or the label to be worth preserving until the late 60s, when the artist took more control. So most artists' recordings, the tapes would get turned into the label, and the only thing the label was likely to hang on to might be the final unmixed master and obviously the album product. I mean, and the typical way of recording back then was all you had was 3-track, or starting in late 65, 4-track. When you ran out of tracks, which happened pretty regularly, you would do some kind of, combination of premix, if you will, and bounce to another 4-track. Well, the only thing the label was likely to keep was that last 4-track, and everything else would go in the dumpster. And while we could decry that today as, horrifying, it was a realistic approach. Otherwise, big labels like Capitol would wind up with a library the size of the state of Rhode Island. And, added to the fact that, they never expected to ever use any of that stuff. Probably the only reason they ever expected to use it was, perhaps doing a foreign language version, which the Beatles did quite a few of early on, and the Beach Boys did one that was I think we released it much later. I don't think it happened at the time. They did a German version of In My Room, sung phonetically, of course.
Yeah.
So the Beach Boys are kind of unique, either because they essentially were a band whose masters were in some way licensed to Capitol. They did almost all their recording in Los Angeles at the same studios. Very few of their tapes ever wound up at the label. They were left at various studios around town. And around 1978, their then engineer, a guy named Tom Murphy, was instructed to go find them all. They then were stored at the Beach Boys studio and later in their archives, which is where they still remain. And it's because of that projects like some of these projects, especially the Pet Sound Sessions box, exists, because we have all these session tapes that show the creative process, which is fairly unusual. There are very few acts that, in that period of time that can boast having that stuff, if they have anything at all. An awful lot of stuff at some point when studios went out of business in the 80s and nobody thought it was worth, retrieving the masters, they just got tossed and wound up in landfill. And we're pretty sure that's what happened to the final 8-track master of Good Vibrations. We know where it was, and we're pretty certain what happened to it. That in 1979, everything left in that particular library, was just summarily destroyed without any attempt to repurpose it, if you will, to the original artist or even the labels. There was a long period of time right up into the mid-'80s when nobody thought this stuff was worth the time of day. And that, it's not just records. Hollywood and the entertainment industry in particular is famous for, storing stuff and then somebody deciding that, the shelf space and telling somebody to go toss it in the dumpster. I personally retrieved stuff that way. There was a studio out here that about, 10, 15 years ago decided to clean out their library. I found out about it because they called me to ask if I knew where a project that I had worked on 20 years earlier, might belong. And when I found out what they were doing, I went over there and looked and actually found some later Beach Boy masters that were labeled Brymer, which was a publishing company that Brian shared with his father Murray in the late 70s. I don't think they would have been junk. They would just still been sitting there. But I'm one of the few people that would have looked at them and, known what they were. We retrieved that. And then another interesting story is that there's a studio out here called Valentine where the Beach Boys recorded in 68. They did Do It Again there and other parts of the 2020 album and a few other things later on. And the studio had been shuttered for about 20 years after the owner died. And about 10, 15 years ago, a friend of mine called me up and said that he had been in the place and it was just mothballed. They just closed the doors and locked it up and left it. And somebody had been in there looking around and noticed in the tape library that there was a tape that said Beach Boys. So I contacted the son and daughter of the original owner who had inherited it. And it took me 8 years to actually get the tape returned. Because, normally a studio would say, oh, yeah, of course, come and get it. But they were not studio people, so they just assumed it's in our dad's studio, we own it. But it took me 8 years to get it back, and it turned out to be one of the songs on the 2020 album called All I Want to Do, a Dennis song that had 3 different versions of the song, and there's actually one of those on Sounds of Summer. On disc 3, I believe. These are the kind of things that we've been dealing with for the past, in my case, 35 years.
Now, the Beach Boys have done a lot of, and by a lot, a lot of albums. Do you have a go-to album, like a favorite go-to album of the Beach Boys? We'll tell you our favorites, too.
Not really albums. It's funny. Like I said, I bought all these records, when they came out. I never really thought of the Beach Boys as an album band until, I'm like everybody else, I mean, Surf's Up I loved them up until Good Vibrations and sort of Smiley Smile. But then, at that point, 1966, 67, I really didn't, pay much attention to Pet Sounds because I was listening to Jimi Hendrix and Jefferson Airplane and, Cream and, all that stuff. I bought all the albums because I was buying albums, but I think I probably bought all those later albums in the cutout bin because they were not big successes. But then Surf's Up, changed that because Surf's Up was the album that made them hip and relevant to, your progressive FM, kind of audience. So I don't really have a favorite album. It's more about individual tracks, and I have to think about what album they're on. And, I have a lot of personal favorites. I mean, some of my favorite records by the group are the ones where Brian is doing, his slice of life things like Busy Doing Nothing. And one of my favorites is just I Went to Sleep. I mean, I just find that so incredible that he can, he could come up with something like that. I mean, it's one of the things he always did. And when I worked with him in the 90s, he was still, recording songs like that. I mean, I guess it makes sense, but it's just something that's always really appealed to me. So I'm more about individual songs than albums. I mean, I would probably, if you're going to pick an album, it would be Pet Sounds like everybody else. And in spite of the fact that, I've worked on it so many, done releases on it, so many times, including this one, it still maintains that level for me. I have to say that, the music still doesn't bore me. A lot of things that I listened to when I was a teenager, I go back and, maybe I'll go listen to that. I really liked it. And I'll go like, what the heck was I thinking? Some of the lesser acts of the Woodstock era, if you will. I won't name any names, but there's some albums from that era that I still love, and and not just because it's nostalgic. I still think they're great records, but there's a lot of records that I listened to back then that I listen to now, and I just I have a lot of trouble figuring out what the appeal was at the time, unless it was the herbs I was smoking back in the day. Starting, 67, I mean, the whole experience of getting, going to the store and looking at the album or reading the review in Rolling Stone and wanting to check out the album and buying it and taking it home and sitting down and, you're like watching a movie. I mean, you put the album on and you listen to it, and maybe you got a little enhanced, but when you read the liner notes and you looked at the artwork and all that, it was a much more dedicated to the art kind of experience. Now, it's wonderful now. I mean, I can go on Apple Music, whatever they're calling it these days, and, probably 99.9% of anything I could think of, any song I could think of, I can pull up, like one enormous jukebox. And it's wonderful, and actually I wouldn't really want it any other way at this point in my life. The fact that people, sat down to experience the music the way it used to be done is quite a different story. And I don't know, frankly, I mean, I know there's all this resurgence in vinyl, but I'm not really sure, whether that applies. I hope it does. I mean, I hope people are sitting down and listening that way. It's sort of been confirmed to me that a large part of the vinyl resurgence is kind of like action figures. It's a collectible more than a way to listen and appreciate the music. But I'm old, so I wouldn't expect it to be the same.
Okay, as promised, I'm going to tell you my favorite album, and then James will give you his. Mine is everybody's favorite, Pet Sounds, but it's only because of Wouldn't It Be Nice? That's my all-time favorite song. And another album closely following it would be Carl and the Passions, So Tough. I like that one a lot, too.
Gosh, it's hard to beat Pet Sounds. I would probably say Sunflower as an overall favorite. But I love the 2020 album. As a kid, I got into Do It Again. I just thought that was the coolest sounding, especially with that intro. And so it's still a favorite.
I have to review a set of test CDs. So I was listening to it all with headphones last night, and that one came on, and I was thinking, man, what a great record. And if you know more about how it came to be, because it started out as a totally different song, essentially. It was more of a track than a song. And then, of course, what a wonderful integration of what they were without being cloying about it. It does hark back to their, their earlier success and catalog without sounding like a moldy attempt to, to revisit that. It really is a great record, but there's so many great records. I mean, I would pick Pet Sounds as well just because it's such a monumental record, and I agree with you about Wouldn't It Be Nice. One of my favorite things, I don't know if you're aware of this, but because we have released it a few times, is the version that we put as a bonus track of Wouldn't It Be Nice without the lead vocal, so you can really hear what the interweaving of the background. To me, as a producer and engineer, that was always something that just completely blew my mind, because it's not even what you'd imagine it probably is, hearing the whole record. That's all. The other thing that I always love is dissecting this stuff and seeing, the construction, especially in the vocals, because it's just so unique and so creative. And what I found was interesting was when I worked with Brian for so long, and a lot of the projects we did, he would do all the background. And it was interesting to watch because, we would double and triple and sometimes quadruple a part. And so he would do the first part, and then he would double it and triple it and quadruple it. And then he would do the next part. Now, most people would have a tough time, and you'd have to rebalance their headphones. And with Brian, 99% of the time, it was just, nope, give me the next part, and he would do 4 of those, the next part do 4 of those, as if he was a human tape recorder, and you're just pushing play, and 4 different performances come out. It was so rare that he would not duplicate the part he had just sung as many times as you needed him to do it, and then go on to the next part and the next part, which to me always related to, how he would do the same thing with the group. He would get, you sing this, Al, you sing this, Mike, you sing this, Carl, on and on. But he had it all in his head. And then, of course, the guys learned how to do that as well. One of my favorite things is, to play a track with the background vocals or an a cappella mix or a track mix, just see how the parts fit together. And, of course, some of that is because that's the kind of thing I've worked with artists, creation for years and years and years. But the Beach Boys just did it so well. I won't say so much better than everybody else. I mean, lots of other great records and musicians and all that, but especially vocally, I mean, just exceptional talent.
It's been over 60 years since Surfin' first single came out. We're still talking about them. Still new projects like this Sounds of Summer, the 3 CD, 6 LP set, and this fall, reading about you guys are gonna digging into the Carl and Passion is So Tough and Holland project sessions and stuff. Man, that's really exciting. Can't wait to hear that. Anything you can tell us about that?
Not a whole lot. I mean, we're progressing through the catalog, and generally do these as 50-year anniversary projects. These are the next 2 albums in a admittedly very creative period for the group, and also when they became a much huger concert draw than they had been just a couple of years before. They really were having a tough time on the road, and suddenly they started playing for thousands of people, and then in the 80s they're playing for hundreds of thousands of people. It's another side of the story that their Surf's Up and their popularity, the rejuvenated popularity with a younger audience, then brought all their own material back to the forefront. As I said, it's interesting when you think about it. It's tough to find. I mean, the Beatles, we put the Beatles in another category because, well, first of all, they were, they broke up and, went their separate ways and made lots of albums. But as a group, they were done, in 1970? That when Abbey Road came out? Yeah. It's hard to find another group, from the early 60s that not only, rejuvenated their career and are still going strong. I can't really think of anybody. An awful lot of artists, their careers were destroyed by the English invasion. Some did oldie shows and some survived a little bit. But, at the time, I Get Around was a #1 record, in the midst of Beatlemania. For a group that had been around since before the Beatles, who admittedly did change, the landscape completely, that's another unique accomplishment. I want to think it's a testimony to the music. I mean, when I was a kid, not thinking about it, I would have said, oh yeah, I like the Beach Boys and I like, if we're talking about this genre, Beach Boys and I like Jan and Dean. And I probably if I really thought about it, I probably would have said that the Beach Boys seemed to be better want of a better word. The records were deeper in a way, more involved than Jan and Dean, but they're pretty much in my same wheelhouse. If I was going to that kind of, that kind of music, I kind of put it all together. The Beach Boys, Jan and Dean, anybody else in maybe even the Ripcords, with Bruce Johnston. But as I got older, I really, I and the world could see the difference. Jan and Dean, and Brian was involved with them as well, obviously, because he wrote Surf City and Dead Man's Curve and I think one or two others, New Girl School. They've really fallen by the wayside. Those records, just seem like your sort of typical 60s pop concoction. Whereas the Beach Boy records, seem like, much more like art. It is interesting that the Beach Boys, were creating kind of timeless music pretty much from the get-go, while still wanting to have hits and still having big hits. I also always found it interesting when I got into the albums professionally that, except for the first one is your Surf and Safari is sort of your typical, 60s rock group album, to capitalize on the success of Surf and Safari. Let's do an album, in an afternoon. And, so there's not a whole lot going on there. Surfing USA changes a whole lot, and everything from then on is pretty much, as we like to say, all killer, no filler. There's a few things here and there, although even the throwaways, like our favorite recording sessions or Bull session with Big Daddy, those are kind of interesting because they're kind of the peek behind the curtain.
Sure.
But there's so many great, the albums from then on are just so full of great records that at best were B-sides. Kiss Me Baby, Please Let Me Wonder, She Knows Me Too Well, just to pull some out of a hat. And one this is interesting, one that Alan Boyd and I, we knew about, but we kind of, we'll say, discovered a few years ago, and that's why it's on this set, Pom Pom Playgirl, which to me is one of the great unsung, amazing Beach Boy records for all kinds of reasons. It's the Beach Boys playing, and we, a few years ago, were able to retrieve the session for it, so it's really interesting to hear that go down and just how amazing they play the whole song in one take when it has a modulation at the end like every 8 bars. But lyrically, it's just this amazing little story about a social climbing cheerleader. And on top of that, when we got the master tapes and dissected it, I can't really confirm this because nobody remembers, but the background part in the verses sounds like a 4-letter word. Well, I guess we could say it in this day and age. It sounds like they are singing "Shit You Not."
Maybe they are.
Yeah, I think they are, and I think they were just having fun, And it is interesting that in listening to the outtakes, because that album, that's the Shutdown Volume 2 album, which that might almost be my favorite album because of just, so Don't Worry Baby and Warmth of the Sun and and Pom Pom Playgirl. In the middle of that, that's when they fired Murray. And there's actually a little outtake where they're doing something, and Dennis or somebody says, "Oh, Murray's gone now, so we can swear," or something like that. So it's just amazing. And it was interesting when I worked on the movie Love and Mercy and actually appear in it as What Else, the engineer. I never got to record in Western 3 where all those records were made. I have recorded in there, but not the way Brian did it. For the movie, they hired real musicians to play the musicians, which was brilliant and made perfect sense because the director, Bill Pollack, wanted it to appear to be as a documentary as opposed to a cooked-up dramatization. And while we initially talked about recording musicians, from another studio, it was decided it was just going to be too elaborate and too expensive. But standing in that room with 12 musicians playing stuff from Pet Sounds was really revelatory. It's interesting that that's what you hear, in the movie. My initial thought was that, doing it with a production mic as opposed to a real recording, that's going to be, that's not going to work so well. And in fact, in the movie, the musical things that I think work less well, and they work fine, but when we're actually using the real recordings as opposed to the musicians playing the musicians, I think those are slightly less effective because they're all gussied up, with all the production expertise that Brian brings to bear. But I really think that the 60s studio scenes in that movie are really, really well done. And we tried really hard and succeeded in making it all as accurate as possible. I mean, the set guys just did an amazing job turning the studio back into what it looked like in 66. I mean, that's one of the reasons I was hired initially, was to keep it authentic. And I wanted to play the engineer because it was it was easier and made more sense to have someone like me play the engineer as opposed to me trying to instruct an actor how to act like an engineer. It's too bad that in the 80s scenes with John Cusack, that although Brian's in the studio a couple of times, they don't have any music scenes, which I think was too bad. It would have been good to have shown that, but it would have been ironic because then they might have had to have somebody portraying me.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
As we mentioned earlier, you've worked with a bunch of different artists in some capacity. Is there an artist that you haven't worked with yet that you'd like to? Maybe Jackson Browne, or I'm kidding.
I've met him a few times. I did a benefit show for him, a remote thing a bunch of years ago. Ooh, that's a tough one. Anybody I aspired to would be, as old as me or older probably. It's almost more about people that I'll be honest with you, it's people that I'd be willing to take the time to work with again. You get to a certain age and suddenly, whereas once upon a time, doing anything with anybody in the studio, was all I could have hoped for. I mean, obviously I'd rather work with, great artists like Randy Newman or the Beach Boys or Brian or something. You get to a certain point where you don't feel that anymore. I mean, when I was 25, the way we made records by that point was you could be in the studio all day and all you're doing is guitar solos, and that was great. I mean, I wish I had been around making records in the 60s when you put everybody in a room and, what you came out with 4 hours later was the backing track to God only knows, and you never added another instrument ever.
Wow, yeah.
One of my highlights of my career was one of the last things I did as an album about 10 years ago now. I did a cast album in New York for a show called Nice Work If You Can Get It, I think, which was a Gershwin show. And we did it in 2 days, as is typical for a Broadway cast album, with the band that played every night in the theater and the talent, the voice talent, everything right there on the canvas. It's just so fulfilling to do it that way, as opposed to the way we've been making records since I was doing it. Where we call them layer cake records, where you might do a backing track with 4 or 5 musicians, and then you're going to add this, and then you're going to add that, and at least you're going to add the vocals, and you sort of it's kind of an interesting process because you don't really have the whole picture, but you got to record it anyway. So unlike the days when if you wanted the piano to sound a little distant, you let it be picked up by the microphone that's 10 feet away, as opposed to, well, no, we got to record it on its own track, and then we'll try to put it, in some kind of artificial space later. I mean, that kind of approach makes for a different kind of record, and a lot of great records. Something about the performance aspect of things, which I guess is maybe what drew me to live recording initially. It's such a rewarding kind of thing. The problem with live stuff now is that, almost everybody, it's so unusual if we do a show with somebody that isn't playing to, backing tracks. And while that can make my job easier, because rather than relying on live background vocals with a bunch of leakage and all that, I've got perfectly, arranged background vocals playing back. The problem is, if the band is playing to click, you can't do much. I mean, every performance is pretty much going to be the same. It's a performance still, but you can't suddenly go, bring the band down behind me, boys, or let's extend the solo, for another 16 bars because everybody's into it. I mean, you just can't do that. It is modified, I won't say karaoke exactly, but the changes in recording technology are we could say a blessing or a curse. They're not in themselves good or evil, but they certainly can lead to either result if you let them.
It's amazing on both sides, what you can do with technology now, but then also, we're talking about the Beach Boys, of course, and the talent and what you can really hear when you separate lead vocals and you hear all the harmonies and stuff going in, or just the vocals by themselves a cappella. It's pretty amazing.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, a good example just to compare the technology. I mean, I did a lot of live records in the 80s and 90s. You know, back then when we went to fix something, you probably wanted to fix the bass or whatever. And rather than try to duplicate the sound and just punch in the mistakes, you just do a whole new pass because it was rather impractical. I mean, you didn't have infinite tracks. Anyway, so if I'm working on a live thing now, and the bass player, I just did this actually, the bass player comes in a bar late, and he should have started a bar earlier. In 2.5 minutes, I can take the missing part from the next bar and move it to the first bar, and now he played it properly. And it makes a difference, you know. So ironically, in terms of a live record, you can make it more real and more as it was performed than the way we used to do it, which was, you know, to replace all kinds of things, you know, because you didn't really have any other way to do it. And, you know, and you know, auto-tune, which is, of course, so preeminent these days, and is used as an effect. I mean, I'll give you an example. I did a show last week with 3 different acts, now admittedly pop acts, 3 female singers, and all 3 of them were having their vocal tuned as they were performing. I mean, an auto program that their microphone was going into, and, you know, a retuned vocal was coming out. I can't tell you, because it wasn't in front of me, how much, you know, tuning was going on, but that's the way they performed. By the same token, you know, if I'm working on a studio album or a live album, you know, and I have a great performance, but, you know, there's a dodgy kind of note or two, I can fix that. The danger, of course, is that you start again taking all the humanity out of it. I mean, if you dissect it, you know, there are out-of-tune moments on everybody's records, the Beach Boys included. It doesn't necessarily affect the quality or the musicality of the performance. If you get too obsessed with, you know, making it correct, quote-unquote, you can actually do more harm than good. I mean, I was doing a project, I mean, a live thing not too long ago, and it's always the country artists for some reason. And so we did the show, and I thought it sounded fine, and then they, you know, everybody, the music director or the producer sort of came in and, oh, we got to fix a couple of, you know, we got to tune a couple of the lines. And once you start down that road, it's very dangerous, because by the end of the night, we had gone through and tuned pretty much 75% of the song. 80% of it didn't need it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure any of it needed it. You know, once you start saying, well, this is the center line on the road, and we're going to stay on that, then, you know, you lose sight of the humanity, I think. You know, it becomes a science project, as a friend of mine used to say.
Yeah. Man, this has been fantastic. Loved hearing about all the stuff that you've done. Of course, you know, the Phil Flows box set last year, the Sounds of Summer coming June 17th, and some more stuff on the way, which those of us that are Beach Boys fans are incredibly excited about. Man, thank you so much for spending time with us. These are some great stories.
No problem.